IVM.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Uncle Please Sit. I'm Joel Pereira and with me as always is my co-host and buddy Tushar Abhichandani. Tushar, what's up?
Same as always, Joel. Same as always in lockdown. Or whatever. Fake lockdown. I mean, it's not a lockdown anymore, but yeah.
No, but you know what? I am not. It says it's not a lockdown, but I'm not going anywhere. I don't think I'm going to go. Yeah, I don't like rest. I live in a part of Bombay where there are lots of restaurants and bars and restaurants are open here. I'm like, no, just no. I walk past them. You know how old people would walk past a bar, like, you know, they'd look at it like a place of sin and that I should quickly walk past this.
I think it's pretty much in that space.
I do that now, you know. I'm like, oh God, what is this Ashleel place? I must quickly walk away from it.
I look at people walking around without a mask and I'm like, wow, you've got balls.
Yeah, seriously, no?
I'm just like, wow, you think you're okay.
Also with us, let me just introduce our guest today. With us today is Anupam Manur. He's an assistant professor at Takshila Institution. And his focus of study is the intersection of economics, public policy, and technology. Anupam, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Anupam, are you from Bombay as well?
No, I'm from Bangalore.
So you're in Bangalore right now?
Yeah.
So what's the situation over there? Are people like being as foolhardy as they are over here in Mumbai?
Oh yeah, I think that's pretty much pan-India. The foolhardiness comes very naturally. So I mean, I was just taking a drive yesterday evening and then I found lots of people thronged together at various at the storefronts and temples and pretty much, I mean, anywhere you go. So the fear has pretty much receded, I would say.
Yeah, I get
people have stopped caring. People have stopped caring.
Yeah. There's fatigue that was bound to set in, and I think that's pretty much set in now.
I guess. I see. On the one hand, I can get it. I get it because, man, I want nothing more than to just go out and like I was chatting with a friend the other day, and I'm like, I miss dim sum, you know, where they just bring it from the steamer straight onto your plate instead of the soggy mess that comes in delivery. And I'm like, I miss these things, but not enough to risk COVID. Yeah, not enough to risk COVID. So
did you start cooking them at home?
You know what? I have been cooking a lot, but I've not reached that yet. As far as dumplings are concerned, they're pretty much like cut out of a packet. And
few more months of this, and I'm sure you'll get there.
Yeah, dude. I'm serious. Like I used to cook earlier, but my panache in the kitchen has improved by leaps and bounds.
We have all upskilled.
Yeah, we've all upskilled. Upskilled or starve.
Yeah, no other option.
No other option, basically. So on today's show, what we're going to be talking about, the reason we have Anupam on the show today is because we want to talk about the economy, but not the economy that exists as it does today, but more as to find out why the economy is today the way it is, in the sense that, you know, from the time we got our independence in 1947, we were very socialist at one point, and then we drifted towards, we had our liberalization. We were a liberal economy for a while. We seem to be drifting again into a lot of socialized economy. And we want to talk about the decisions or the context as to when these economic policies took place. And also break a lot of myths and misinformation about these policies. So after the break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's been a really, really great week on the network. Let me make a couple of recommendations to you guys. Agla Station Adulthood, they have an extraordinary episode on relationships. Ritasha and Ayushi, as always, do a bang-up job. I think you'll really enjoy that conversation. Check out Edges and Sledges, where DJ Ashwin and Varun have been talking to fans from different IPL teams on every episode. It's a really, really interesting project they've taken on during the course of the IPL. And as it comes to a conclusion, I'm sure you'll love to hear the thoughts on the tournament as a whole. I want to mention Uncle Please Sit. They had a really great episode which dove into why is pollution so bad. And I think that given the circumstances we're dealing with right now, it makes a ton of sense to listen to that. Cyrus had a really great week on his show as well. On the Monday episode, he spoke to Raj and DK about all kinds of stuff. He was in one of their early movies. Definitely a fun conversation. Do check that out. And finally, let me talk to you about the Wire Talks with Siddharth Bhatia. We're very excited about this show. On the first episode, Jairam Ramesh is there having a conversation with Siddharth Bhatia about the legacy of Indira Gandhi. I think you will really, really get something out of this. Do give it a listen. And with that, let me get you back to your show.
And we're back. With us today, of course, is as always is Tushar, and also Anupam Manur, who's an assistant professor at Takshila Institution, and his focus of interest is economics, public policy, and technology. Anupam, welcome back. And you heard the intro. Is this subject too vast or too vague to deal with in a single podcast?
Definitely. I would suggest at least a 10-part series, but I'm sure no one has that liberty.
No. And 10-part series would imply that I myself have enough knowledge and enough qualifications to run something like this. Because my interest in this is you'd say above average, but nothing more. Which is why we need an expert in this room.
Yeah, no, I'm probably good for a 2-part series. If you want a 10-part series, I would recommend someone like Tirthankar Roy. And this is just I'm throwing out a book recommendation for anyone else interested in this. Tirthankar Roy has an excellent, he's probably the expert on India's economic history, and that's not the 1600s and so on, but that is post-independence economic history of India.
Right.
I would strongly recommend that.
What is do you remember what the book is called?
There's something called Google, which I think people can use.
Wow. Shade already. No, so, okay. So then what we're going to do is, we're obviously not going to do a 10-part series on economic history of India, but what we're going to do is we're just going to offer our listeners maybe like a primer. Okay, this was what the situation was at that time, and hence these things were done. Right? I think we'll just do that, and we'll be able to cover. So let's start. Sorry, Tushar.
Chronologically, let's start chronologically.
Yeah.
So if we had to go there, let's get to a point where just around the time of independence, and maybe just before that, what did the Indian economy look like?
In a word, the Indian economy was in shambles. As in, we know the broad kind of stories around it. We were under the British rule for a long period by now, at the time of independence, and which meant that a lot of our resources were systematically looted by the British, as the common kind of knowledge goes. So I don't want to get too deep into all of the looting and what the British did to India, etc. But we know for a fact that you go back 200-300 years before independence, and India, clearly there are statistics which show that India was probably one of the leading economies in the world, along with, let's say, China and so on. And that systematically goes away in about 300-400 years time. And so at the time of independence, India is one of the poorest countries in the world. Wide scale poverty. We had extreme income inequality, and which means that there were hardly a handful of people who had some form of resources at their command, and the rest of Indians were at near abject levels of poverty. Along with this, of course, you had there was no industry to speak of. Indian agricultural productivity was extremely low. You had fragmented land holdings, a whole bunch of things, and these are, by the way, themes that we'll probably keep bumping into in the next 70 years as well, with slight improvements here and there, probably big improvements in a few places, but only ever so slight improvements in some of these areas. That's a very broad kind of picture of what the Indian economy looked like at the stroke of independence. What are the big takeaways? I think, if you had to look at the positives, I would say that there were a few things that probably stand out. A few of the institutions which were set up, and this is not just limited to economics, but, when we talk about the role of institutions in an economy, you could look at, the court system was set up, and that was running reasonably well. Of course, it was running under the British, but that changed quite seamlessly into the Indian judicial system. You had RBI, which was set up in 1935, for instance. The rupee was extremely strong. For instance, and probably not a lot of people know this, but the rupee was far stronger than the dollar. At just after independence. So you would have to exchange about $2 or $3 for every rupee.
Wow.
Right. So this is something that, which is not commonly known. And then, there was, of course, one thing that a lot of people talk about, which is the railways. But of course, the railways were set up for a very specific purpose of, looting India. But again, that was there as one of the positive.
Something positive.
Yeah. So this was, so you had wide-scale poverty, India being one of the poorest countries in the world in terms of GDP and per capita GDP. A population surge at that point of time, just after, and economy completely weakened by the years of British rule. So even in terms of the resources that we had, natural resources, we had to start building up some of these things. And at the same time, so I said a few institutions which existed, but there was a whole bunch of institutions which didn't exist. And we had to start building that up from scratch.
So this is, okay, so now we are at 1947. The Raj has ended. The British have like taken the last ship from the gateway of India, and now Nehru is in command, right? Nehru has been chosen as the prime minister. The first elections have not happened. So at that time, could you give us a state of, for instance, not in terms of numbers, but like, you spoke of institutions a little earlier. What were they at that time? Besides, was there, for instance, a central bank, or what was the state of capital at that time?
Yeah, you had a central bank, and probably that is, one of the institutions which has survived quite well until very recently. So the RBI was set up in 1935.
Okay.
So it was well established, and the other institutions were just about coming into fore. I think a lot of the institutions were established in the constitution itself and given constitutional mandates and powers, right? So that's kind of important. Just post-independence, and we're talking about probably 1950s is when the institutional building happened. But a large part of so this is the institutions, but we didn't have industries to boast of. Educational institutions, for instance, were just missing. At least the kind of institutions that was required, both at the most basic level. So you're talking about primary education centers in India just was not there. Right. That could build the base. You didn't have even health centers, for instance. The public health system in India was terrible at that point of time, which, again, you could look at the number of deaths that were happening because of various easily preventable communicable diseases in 1950s. We lost a lot of manpower to just diseases in the 50s, right? And 40s and 50s. So in that sense, the institutions very, very weak. We had pretty much nothing to export except extreme, raw materials. So essentially what the British were doing, and, they had established trade links with the rest of the world for raw materials. And that's pretty much the only thing we could export even after independence.
Yeah.
Right. So immediately what we did was we were scared of that. And therefore we kind of put a stop to that. We put, restrictions on what we could export because we didn't want, at some sense, all of our raw materials to just go out of the country.
And Anupam, you spoke about life expectancy, and I remember doing a story some time ago about, our state of healthcare. And if I recall, our life expectancy of the average Indian person in 1950 was 31. It was literally 31. I mean, I think all of us are past our 30s. Statistically, if we were in 1950, we should have all been dead by now.
Yeah, there was a very good chance that we wouldn't be present or existing.
That statistic is a bit misleading because it also includes the infant mortality.
No, but you know what? If you
crossed a certain age, then your chances were much higher.
If you cross, not much higher. If you cross the age of 10, where you are not a child anymore, then your chances of living went up to, I think, 44, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So
that's much higher than 31.
But it's not that much, man. 44. 44 is like, I'll be 44 soon.
Well, thankfully you were born in this era.
Yeah, man. Seriously. So sorry, Anupam, go on, please.
Yeah, I mean that was the the status of our healthcare. And it was just back then, you had polio, you had chicken pox, you had people dying because of smallpox, all sorts of things. And remember, this was again before the big vaccination drives that happened much later on. So public health was in terrible matters. And of course, we didn't have good sanitation. If you bring it down to even extreme micro levels, houses didn't have sanitation or access to clean drinking water. People died of starvation. A lot of them. This is something, it seems like just an arbitrary statement we are making, and for probably a lot of people who consume podcasts on their fancy, iPhones and on Apple Store, it might seem something that they cannot relate to, but this was happening quite a lot in the early years. So our transition to a country, and which is why if you look at some of the statements back then, from Mark Twain to Winston Churchill to a whole bunch of people around the world, almost nobody gave India a chance that we would survive. Politically as one union of all the states, and more importantly, I think they felt that India did not have the adequate resources nor the capacity to evolve into a modern economy which could cater to the wishes and aspirations of, back then it was probably 400-500 million people. So that was the reason why nobody gave us a chance. And in fact, I think probably a lot of people within India itself were quite skeptical. Few people, at least the urban elites, the minority of urban elites, were probably thinking that we were better off under the British, because they were extremely cynical and skeptical of whether we could pull this off, being an independent country, right? And again, historically, if you look at a lot of other countries that became independent around that time, either became a dictatorship or were colonized by someone else close to them, or were, again, the entire country kind of broke down and became a failed state. So,
I remember reading somewhere that in 1959, I believe, or was it the mid 60s, if I'm not mistaken, we were between Turkey and Australia. If you look at the world map, we were the only democracy between Turkey and Australia. There was a time when even current countries which are democracies, like even South Korea and all those places, Taiwan, were not, and they were all military dictatorships. So was that why? So Nehru, of course, was one of the architects of Indian economic policy at that time, and he's got a lot of brickbats for it, some valid, some not. But Nehru was essentially what today we would call, I think he was, back then it was called a Fabian, and I think today would call a democratic socialist. Essentially, Nehru was progressive, was Bernie Sanders, or similar.
Pretty much, exactly. And it's strange. I think history is at times extremely kind to Nehru and extremely unkind to Nehru. And pretty much like everything else around us in today's age, the opinion on Nehru as well is polarized, right? You've got two extremes. Some who love him and say that we are what we are entirely because of Nehru, and the others say that as well, but in an extremely negative connotation. So there's unfortunately there's the disappearance of the middle ground, right? But I think if we ever have the capacity to look at this in an objective manner, I think Nehru would fall right in the middle. There were a lot of errors that he made, and we will not talk about the errors in social. In terms of international relations, which can again probably
that's
have
another
podcast. But strictly economically speaking, you realize that some of the things that he did were needed at that time, and it's also a remnant of the British rule. I think the biggest legacy from the British rule is not so much the poverty and so on. Of course, that's a very real thing, and a tangible thing. But in terms of intangibles, I think it was initially the fear of the external world and fear of the corporation. So if you look at the way economic history has shaped in India for the first 30-40 years, we didn't really recover from that fear of the East India Company. And this is something that is slightly I think it's not something that really comes up a lot, the psyche of the Indian policy maker in the initial years, but I think this has a big role to play, the fear of the East India Company. So if you look at the way policy was formed just after independence, we were scared of big corporations, and therefore we limited the powers of private enterprise. We were really scared of having a deal. International trade. So we put extreme controls over what we could export and what we could import. And of course, all of this comes along with India's. It's not just the fear, but we also had very severe restrictions and limitations in terms of how much foreign exchange we had in order to deal with others, how much purely there was very realistically and tangibly, now coming from that intangible thing of the fear to now something tangible, there was a massive coordination problem, right? In fact, in my master's thesis, I actually looked at how easy or difficult it is to transition, from a state-owned and state-run kind of enterprise. And if you look at, there's a British-controlled enterprise, economy, which we were, to a market-based economy is extremely difficult. Yeah, and there are more failures than successes.
And just to put it into context, okay, like you talked about the fear of the corporation, and this is just correct me if I'm wrong here, but 1953, the British deposed the socialist leader of Iran at the behest of big oil, right? Yeah. The CIA was toppling governments all across Central America at the behest of big fruit.
Iraq as well.
The Americans knocked off, almost fought a nuclear war conflict with Fidel Castro, based, some say, pushed by the entertainment industry, because, and the sugar industry. So that fear of companies running foreign policies of former colonial countries was absolutely very real. It was a very real thing.
Real. And also the fact that you've gone from not having any control of your country for 200 years to suddenly having all the responsibility of running a place with minimal resources. I think it had to have like a massive effect.
Yeah.
So, for sure.
Anupam was saying, right, the psyche as to what were they thinking, which is what I want to get to actually in this podcast. Like, what were they thinking? We know the 5-year plan, we know the command and controlled economy, we know all that stuff.
But why did they do the things that they did?
Why did they? Like, for instance, okay, let's, as a hypothetical, let's say at that time, right, in the 50s, if I'm sure Nehru was being pressured there must have been pressure to open up the 300 million is still a decently large, could be a decently large market. There must have been pressure, right, at that time from the West or from corporations, etc., to open up the Indian market.
Yeah, sure. So externally there was pressure. I think as you could expect in any country which has, just recently gotten independence and is looking at, here and there. And let's also not forget, this is the time when the Cold War in the 50s, when also you had the Cold War, so there was pressure from the US to be a capitalist economy, and you had pressure from the Soviet Union to, again, go towards socialism and so on. And Nehru was, again, his personal inclinations was also slightly towards, let's say, socialist principles. From, purely what he had seen and so on, from a personal kind of growth story, which, again, I don't want to speculate too much on that because, none of us can really know.
Of course, yeah.
So there was that, but funnily enough, internally there was no pressure, and you have this, the Bombay Plan. If I think many of the listeners would have heard of it when Mahalanobis, etc. We formed the 5-year plan, etc. So Nehru called for this meeting of the large industrialists from the country, and there was about 19-20 people who attended that meeting, and in fact, all of them said that we should go towards a socialist. This thing, and they had internal reasons why they didn't want foreign competition, nor did they want to suddenly open up the market for all sorts of entrepreneurship who would provide competition. These were well established,
and names like JRD Tata or GD Birla or Bajaj, I think was also there. Kasturba Lalbhai, I think, was Arvind Mills, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry.
Yeah, so internally there was complete pressure to actually go the socialist way. But even before I think we go into that, the interesting question of why, right, or why they did it. Again, looking back, it's quite easy to say that we shouldn't have gone the socialist way, etc. But I think there was a very real problem of coordination. So if you've just turned into a market, or at least you've thrown over your entire system of governance and you're trying to start afresh, the market doesn't form overnight for anything, really. Right? It takes time, and how much time we don't know. For example, I mean, you can take a very simple kind of thing, right? Complex supply chains don't develop overnight because there is a massive amount of uncertainty. And again, we have to remember that this was an economy which was not doing well at all. So, I mean, you had large number of people who were below the poverty line, however that was defined. And so it was not that you had a guaranteed market.
People were dying of starvation, as you said.
Yeah. And so you couldn't say, okay, I'm going to produce this thing and then and expect people to, queue up and buy that, right? You didn't have that certainty. So, from the smallest level to the highest level of goods, you had that uncertainty whether that if you produce something, would people actually buy it? Can you make a profit from it? Right? So you can think of, if there is a manufacturer of aluminum, for example, at the highest level, you didn't know whether there would be someone who would start a factory to produce aeroplanes and who would purchase that. So that market would never develop on its own. And so you can think of, again, you wouldn't have the guarantee that there'll be a car industry which will buy your steel, and therefore you will not start the steel. And because there is no steel, you wouldn't have car industry, right?
So you needed so institutional capacity building was needed.
Yeah, and that could only come from the government at that
time. The only people
at that time, right? So I think this is where again, in retrospect, it's kind of easy to say we shouldn't have gone that way, but this was the coordination problem exists in a very real sense. Now, if we had the liberty of, let's say, having very good per capita income where you could afford to have this transition. Now, think about the transitions that other countries did, even the successful ones. For instance, in the 90s. And I'm talking about the transition from a socialist kind of setup to a capitalist setup in the 90s, from Hungary to, of course, the big one, which is Russia, to Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, etc. All of them had a much higher per capita income. So, you could wait for the markets to develop. India did not have that luxury. You either started, having jobs tomorrow, or you had, every day that you didn't provide jobs meant that people are dying of starvation. So, there was that sense of urgency, and that is why I think the government kind of said, okay, we have to do some of these big things at least. So there was this, and this is what is called as the big push. So Nehru realized that unless the government provides this big push in terms of, at least providing the skeletal framework for industry to take off, it would not happen on its own. So, which is why they did the big kind of industry in either, from one extreme of building dams and so on to the other of, steel, iron and steel is your big example, right? You have big government players to other PSUs, HAL, the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, if you trace back some of our most successful industries, you can trace it back to some of the big push that was done back in the 50s.
Like the petroleum company.
Also this was a conversation I was having with my father, because my father's worked with a lot of these companies, and he was like, we criticize the public sector units, but some of India's best manpower has come from there, because everyone's learned from there only.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at some of the aerospace things that are happening here, there, you'll always have some, let's say, alumnus from HAL. If you look at, the kind of amazing things that Indian Pharma is doing, you will have people who worked in, the Indian Drugs and Pharmaceutical Limited, IDPL, and so on and so forth, right? So, Earth from BML to whatever, all of these things had some form of, and Bangalore, by the way, is the PSU city. Yeah. Bangalore has grown entirely because of the initial PSUs that were set up here from, HAL, BML, all of these things were set up in Bangalore. So you still have those.
Even like you're talking about Earth moving and ISRO and things like that, but even something as little as HMT was a public sector company, and that was also based in Bangalore, because the private sector did not have the capacity to manufacture watches.
Yeah, exactly. So
okay, so now let's zip.
Also, one small thing.
Tushar.
Around this same time, around this initial big push, what was happening with agriculture, in the sense, like, since it was still at that point, I mean, it still is our biggest employment generator.
When we're talking about the institutions and the big push from the government, we have to remember that one other really big push that the government did, and that was in the education sector. there is again a success story and a failure story beautifully intertwined, such that again we can't have a very clear view on whether what we did back then was right or wrong in a binary sense. So you can think of the IITs and the IIMs, etc., that were established in the late 50s and 60s, and that has provided, even today, those are some of the best educational institutions which were established by the thing, and they've continuously paved the way for other education, higher education, and especially college education and so on. So they paved the way for other institutions to come up and provided the necessary kind of labor force for the industries back then. So you had that, again, some form of link between the big industries they set up and the education institutions. The failure, and I think this is some form of a valid criticism, is that there was too much of an emphasis on the higher education, whereas your primary education wasn't
suffered.
Right? So there was absolutely no big investment from the government to get the primary education right. But if you look at the success stories from across the world, they actually got the primary education right and left the big institutions, the IITs and IIMs, to the private industry. So while you have, Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale, which are run by largely private fund trusts and so on, the primary education is still run by the government and run quite well. But India did the opposite. And, well, again, there are merits and demerits, but I would say we definitely missed a big trick by not getting the basics right, which is primary education and primary healthcare. Those are two things that we failed miserably almost.
Okay, so now we have a picture of this, of post-independence. Now, let's say we zip to 1965, okay, or say 1966. We have, Nehru has been dead a year and a half by now, okay. We have just fought a stalemate war with Pakistan. Lal Bahadur Shastri was a short-lived prime minister who is also, I think, passed away right now. And 1966, I think, was the start of the Green Revolution, right? So, and also I think the real step up of socialism. Would that be a accurate way to describe it?
Yes, definitely. So, there's actually the 60s is a fascinating period.
Okay.
Probably for all the wrong reasons, but again, since we are kind of distant from the consequences of that, slightly distant from the consequences of that, we can discuss it impassionately. But you look at, again, the wars that happened 1962, 1965. And
with the Portuguese as well.
Yeah, exactly. 3-1. So, yeah. And importantly,
I like how the Goan chimes in.
Yeah. Sorry, we won't forget that aspect. So what has happened, I think, again, something that may not, again, be known a lot, is that correspondingly you also had a massive dip in the economy. So you had at least 2 or 3 years around that time where you had where you had negative economic growth, right? And so the economy actually contracted at that point of time. The forex reserves in India were falling. This is on the macro kind of level. So you had the forex reserves which were falling, and then even the Congress at that point of time had the number of seats in the parliament, for example, was dipping, right? So in 1967, when the elections took place, Congress had won about 283 seats of the total 520, which was much, much lower than 361 out of 494 that it had won in 1962, right? And they'd also lost power in about 7 states, etc. So I'm just setting up the scene at which Indira Gandhi came to power. So you had 2 wars, death of Nehru, death of Lal Bahadur Shastri. At the same time, economic growth dipping to a complete kind of negative territory, forex reserves falling, rupee was at that time not, again, because of all of these, not doing well, etc. All of these put together paved the way for that socialistic turn, or sharper turn towards socialism, which happened because of Indira Gandhi. Now, there are 2 parallel stories that we need to discuss here. One, a relatively good story, which is the Green Revolution, and one which is this socialistic thing. So we can take up, but the background remains the same. If you want to discuss the Green Revolution, we have to go back again a little bit to say what was happening in agriculture, right? Agriculture in India, again, unfortunately, I think is more romanticized in our popular discourse, which leads to, I think, a specific type of policy making. So while there was this fear of the corporation in the Indian psyche, at the same time, there was this, I think, slightly untoward romance with Indian agriculture and Indian villages.
Yeah, we've discussed this in another podcast about our continuing love for parochialism.
Yeah. Rural India.
And rural India.
Yeah,
some utopia that it is.
It's baffling that that's the case now, but okay, let's give a little bit of probably leeway in the 60s under the garb of that we didn't know better. But Indian agriculture at the point of independence was, as I said, I mean, it was not doing well. Productivity was one of the lowest, and then we did the Land Reform Act, etc. So a lot of land grabbing. The government actually took away land from a lot of big farmers and then divided it. Now, there's social kind of merit to that because it was, the whole caste equation, etc. that came in, class and caste equation that came in, which again, we should not probably diverge too much into that. But because of that, you essentially ended up with extremely small holdings of land, which meant that we could not be as productive as we otherwise could have been given the fertility of the soil and so on. And so you ended up with extremely low productivity in agriculture up to 65. The quality of seeds were low, fertility of the soil were being lost, we were using outdated techniques. So again, this is one thing that we always say, right, that agriculture was the largest provider of employment. True, but it was also the largest provider of disguised unemployment, which meant that, you literally had about 75% of the people who were working in agriculture were not doing anything at all. One person could, technically do the job of 5 people, but, it was a family-run enterprise. It was not, in any way commercialized. It was not modernized. It was not professionalized. Definitely, it's not even now. So you had families who had small farms who could, basically produce for themselves, plus a little bit extra to sell on the market. Even then, a lot of it was barter, right? You've grown X number of kgs of rice extra, and then you barter that with something else that someone has done. We're talking about 60s, not, the 1700s and 1600s.
Right.
Though it might seem like it.
Yeah.
So it is in that context that the Green Revolution came about. Now, again, I think we should keep mentioning what we're going to leave out, and that's the environmental impact, etc. Of the Green Revolution. But
which definitely we actually discussed in our last episode.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
At least the pollution side of it.
Yeah, definitely. I won't get into it then. Yeah. Since we did it in the last episode. But the Green Revolution was the first real big income boost of the citizens of India. So while what we talk about the big push in the 50s established the big industrial estates and so on, it was still government run. It didn't provide mass employment as one would have hoped. Right? It was still a very niche thing, which meant, you working in HAL required a certain degree of education that you could get in and so on. So it was still an elite club, the big push in the 50s. The 65 push, Green Revolution push, was really one for the masses. Again, that's how one would have wished for. But of course, even there, it was the big push for the masses in Punjab and Haryana and so on, not necessarily for the farmers throughout.
And the big farmers, I'm assuming.
Yeah. Even the relatively richer farmers benefited, but let's even take that. And realize that there was a big push in incomes for the masses at that point of time. And so that is 1965. And that Green Revolution kicked off a whole bunch of things. There was excess production for the first time. And so the Green Revolution has to be seen not just in the context of course, how people benefited from it, which was a lot. As I said, incomes doubled overnight, and farm holdings grew. That was the first time some modernization happened because of that income. Incomes were reinvested back into the capital and technology. So and there you mean tractors and irrigation systems and so on, right. Because of the high yielding seeds. But parallelly, you should also look at what it meant for India's food security. So until then, we were dependent for sometimes even on the US for under that the US 40 program basically was the US would drop off grains and rice and wheat, etc., to many of the developing countries. I mean, less developed countries back then. And India was a beneficiary of that. So we literally had to rely on the largest and the of US and other countries, right? And similarly, we had other kind of deals with the USSR. But the Green Revolution at least gave that level of food security to India. For once, we had excess production, and which meant, now you could begin to think, not necessarily immediately, but in a few years' time, you could actually begin to think of granaries where you could store excess food production, which is unthinkable just 10 years back. So that's the importance, macroeconomic importance of the Green Revolution.
Yeah, I
think I'm assuming it also adds a certain degree of stability and also helps the self-esteem of the country.
Definitely, right? I mean, if you're dependent on the most basic import, which is for food on other countries, and not even import, right? We were getting it, literally begging for it. I mean, excuse my this thing, but that was what it was. And the US and Russia were playing a game of, can we win over India by giving them food? Right? I mean, that's as low as it can get in terms of self-esteem in the international arena.
And from what I understand, even Lyndon Johnson sort of used it to blackmail us also occasionally.
Yeah. I mean, all of those things would happen in the international arena. Yeah. So,
I mean, if you're listening to this and you ask your parents or your grandparents, my mom talks about this, like how in the 60s, she was telling us that they would get these big bags of this premix, which was like a mix of broken wheat and oats and sugar and milk powder, etc., and it used to come from America, and it had the USAID wala shield on it, the shield with the blue and red stripes, and that was a big day for them. That was like Diwali, because they were so deprived because these were people who were eating who thought that eating chapati with some sugar was like a good meal. So for them to eat those things, and this was like barely 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
So let's move to one of the big, we've talked about the Green Revolution. One of the things that was also done at that time was the nationalization of a lot of the banks. Right. What was the reasoning at that time for that? And also, a lot of people would, like, Indira Gandhi was the PM at that time and she was driving policy, but she would be considered socialist. But was she really?
Yes, and yes, and yes. I mean, I don't see I don't see it in any other way. So here is where I'll make my biases very clear.
Right.
I think it's good for the listeners and for you folks as well. I'm by and large a pro-market economy guy. I think markets can deliver the best outcomes, etc., etc., etc. I don't necessarily have any political bias. One party, or at least I will not let that interfere in any of the conversation here. But the economic bias is purely, I'm an economist, right? So it's pro-market. And even then, as I said, I can find justifications for what happened in the 50s. Very strong, very good justifications for what happened in the 60s, which not in the 50s, sorry, which not necessarily is always economic in nature. It can be political and social, as to what Nehru did. So, I mean, for instance, one of the things that we didn't speak about is, also the class and ethnicity angle of why you needed the big push from the government. If you there were only few people, more or less from one set of ethnicity, that were dominating Indian business there. And if you had left it, you would see a situation where that ethnicity would, again be by and large the dominant one, leaving others behind. It would lead to inequality, etc. So there was a lot of, I think, justifications for what happened in the 50s that one could find. But in the 60s, I think it was a pure political move. So we talked about the backdrop of all of this, the wars, the two prime ministers passing away, and then Indira Gandhi coming to power at a time when the Congress was at its weakest level.
Right.
I think that we should not forget that. And I don't want to go into personality politics at all, but just one thing is that Indira Gandhi was young, did not have a very good clue about politics or economics at the time that she came into power. At least that's the general story that's painted, right? So initially it was a lot of her advisors who were running the show, right? Now, even if we ignore all of that aspects, the at the time of 1967-68, there are very clear statements about this given by Indira Gandhi herself that she wanted to be seen as a reformer, and she wanted to be seen as a very strong reformer who could pave the way for India's next kind of story. If that kind of 1965 marked or 66 marked the end of one story, the Nehru Shastri kind of story, now was the next chapter in India's story, and she wanted to be the lead and the one who would forge it. So she didn't want to just carry on the kind of existing policies, but wanted to have her imprint in that. And the best way that she could do it is to say that the reforms were all extremely socialist in nature. That was probably her belief, or the ones of her advisors. There was also a significant kind of influence from, as I said, the USSR at that point of time. I mean, that is when India made a very decided and a clear kind of leaning towards USSR and its policies. Right, we had better deals with USSR. We even got loans from USSR, which at extremely low rates of interest. We got rupee loans, and these loans were not even in rubles; these were in rupees, right? Which is very rare, A whole bunch of these things. So that push for power and the push to establish herself was done through the bank nationalization. That which happened in the 1969, right? Now, again, at that point of time, remember, it was not... so there was a bit of a history for this as well. It's not just in 1969, right? There's a bit of history for this as well. I think, again, we only tend to see what Indira Gandhi did in 69, but if we look at, the history of banks and insurance, etc., the insurance sector in India was nationalized in 1956. In 1955 you had SBI, which was nationalized. What was the private bank called? I think it was called Imperial Bank. Right. I'm not mistaken. I mean, don't hold me for this, but I think it was called Imperial Bank, and that was nationalized in 55 to become SBI.
SBI, yes.
Right. So there was, and the insurance sector was then nationalized, etc. So come 1969, so there was a template. There was a template, and there was a precedent for this. It didn't come out of thin air. And then we said, okay, we've done it before. Why not go all out? Okay. And that was Indira Gandhi's thinking in 1969, saying, okay, this is going to be my legacy. Right? And so there's, again, it was not just bank nationalization, by the way. If we can talk more about this perhaps later. But there was a whole bunch of other things that Indira Gandhi did at that same time, right? Which was, for once the central or union government and not the central bank, not RBI, actually did the intervention in the foreign currency market. So it was devalued from 4.76, I think, to the dollar. 4.6 per US dollar to about 7.5 to the US dollar in 1966. Right. So there's a whole bunch of things that happened at the same time, which was all towards higher government intervention in markets. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Right.
So do you think that so a lot of times the criticism is ulta in the sense that we should not be focusing on Nehruvian socialism?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where I come from, at least. I think the Nehruvian I think the criticism is that whatever steps that Nehru took in the 50s paved the way for what Indira Gandhi did in 60s. But as I said, the circumstances are entirely different. In fact, the ideal, and this is just my opinion now, this is, not a fact, but according to me, the ideal one would have been to dismantle the big socialist steps that we took in 50s and start privatizing them in the 60s. Instead, we went the exact opposite direction and nationalized more and more and more, right? So again, you can't blame Nehru for what he did in the 50s, but you can definitely blame for doubling up on that in the 60s.
Because at that time, in hindsight, we know that we should have been loosening up rather than doubling down on these things.
I look at them as India's Brezhnev years.
Yeah.
Which, weirdly enough, parallel also.
Yeah, it is. So that also gives birth, the 60s and this kind of nationalism gave birth to a whole bunch of things. An extremely strong bureaucracy, because now they had the control. And we can go into depth in each of them as much as you please, but an extremely strong bureaucracy, right? So if you talk about the red tapeism,
so is the license quota Raj a legacy of the Indira years?
Absolutely. 100%. I mean, it didn't happen in 69. That was what happened in the 70s. And we can talk about each one of these things, right? From MRTP Act, the strengthening of all of the, labor laws, for instance. All of this started from the 69. But the key, and I think the crucial thing is, once you've given the control and the key to the economy to the bureaucrats, they gain complete power.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to let go. Right. So, and so they found innovative ways of increasing that power and utilizing that power. So you had more inspections, you had more this thing, again, legislations were drawn in such a way that gave more and more power to them. Right. So this happened throughout, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then it started getting dismantled at about 85. But I guess we'll come to that later. But yeah, bank nationalization was probably one of the biggest economic blunder. So that's again my opinion. I don't know if others agree or not.
So what would you say to people who say that it brought banking to a lot of people? Or is that just a very rosy attempt at justifying it?
Yeah, again, this is one of those things, right? I think there's no single policy in the world which doesn't have both pluses and minuses. But when you do, in public policy and in economics, the real important thing is the cost-benefit analysis, right? It's not only benefits, it's not only cost. You have to look at both. This is a classic thing. You can say, just because British laid the railroads.
Yeah, it's like British justifying the railways, pretty much.
Exactly, right? Or you to say that, I'm sure if you try really hard, you can find some positive, something like demonetization as well.
That's true.
But that doesn't justify that act.
That's true.
In any way possible.
Yeah.
Right. So it's one of those things. So yes, there were real problems with the banking sector. Let's not say that the banking. So okay, there were good things with the banking sector, and in fact, extraordinary things happening in Indian banking. And one of the extraordinary things was that Mangalore, the coastal area of Mangalore, Bombay. Okay, fine. For Joel's sake, I'll say Goa as well, though not really. But really, the Mangalore South Canara belt, as we call it, right, was the banking hub of India. And the number of private entrepreneurs who got into the banking industry. So if you look at all your big banks today, whether it's Canara Bank, Syndicate Bank, your
HDFC,
Bank of India, the whole bunch of things. I don't want to misquote some bank and say, but a large percentage of them started in the South Canara belt in the 50s. Right. And so it was extraordinary. And we had a very vibrant kind of banking culture. However, I think, so that's a good aspect. And I think for an infant democracy and an infant economy, our banking sector was wonderful. It was this thing. And for, again, just a hat tip, if anyone is interested, please go look up the writings of Amol Agarwal, who's now I think a professor of economics at Ahmedabad University. So he's done his entire PhD in IMB on the history of banking in India. And it's fascinating. Yeah, it's really fascinating. So that's a good thing about the banking sector. But I think the reason why, again, if you want to go into the why it was done, banks would not lend according to the wishes of the government. Banks would lend according to, let's say, merit. And these are private banks which lent according to merit. So you gave collateral, they would do capital adequacy norms, all of those things that it's supposed to do. They wouldn't lend to everyone and this thing. But that went against this now socialist turn of the government, right? So they wanted priority sector lending. Right? So they wanted loans to be given to agriculture. So back then, I think I'm pulling a statistic from the depths of my memory, but if I'm not mistaken, agriculture accounted for only 2% of total credit offtake.
Wow.
So for context, how much is it now?
It's not really,
or at least ballpark.
I have no clue. I don't want to say something which is wrong, but it's not too much. It's still quite low. But again, so which is why you do the farm loan waivers, the whole bunch of things. But if you leave it to the banks alone, of course, you need collateral, right? So which is why I think, and again, so it's not just agriculture, but it was, MSMEs, your cottage industry, all of these things that the government wanted to promote as part of its industrial policy suffered Well, because it was not getting credit. And the reason it was not getting credit is, of course, they didn't have collateral or even a business plan. Right? So you can't fault the banks for this. But yeah, that's the nature. So government wanted, this push that credit should be given. Now, so which is why they nationalized the banks. So
But
that might seem like a justification. Yeah.
But obviously nationalized the banks and also tried to shut down monopolies, created the license Raj, and transferred a lot of power to the bureaucracy, which is I think from around where we started getting our current economic consciousness, and where we were, this feeling of the government is coming in the way of the what do you call it, of the private sector and so on and so forth. People started feeling this around the 80s, right?
Yeah. So so in the 70s, I think the biggest thing was something called the MRTP Act. And I unfortunately cannot go ahead without mentioning it. MRTP Act and FEMA, I mean, if you just want two prime examples of what exemplified the turn towards socialism, I think these two acts will let you know, right? MRTP is the Monopoly and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, which essentially meant that the government didn't want any company to grow too big. So they wanted to, deliberately, consciously limit how successful a business can be. Now, if I put it this way, I know it sounds absolutely ridiculous because it is, right? And let's try and unpack it, right? Your own government doesn't want you to succeed,
right? Yeah.
Right? Because they say, okay, you get too big, then you get too much power. But yeah, you do. But that the only way against it is to have more competition. So allow more people to get big. Not prevent the ones who are getting big, right? So this is a classic socialism thing, right? Because you don't want anyone to get first rank, either abolish all ranks or bring the first rank guy down, and so that he gets a C minus. So everyone is at C minus, right? So that I think was the epitome of MRTP Act, and that obviously resulted. We know all the stories. Again, if anyone has spoken to their parents or their uncles and so on, you'll. The uncles who should be sitting, you get these stories, right, of people waiting 10 years for a telephone, people waiting 18 years for a bike. I don't want to again get into this because I think now they're cliche in terms of stories, but the reason behind all of that was the MRTP Act. And so I think if you had to look back and list 2 or 3 of the biggest blunders in Indian economic policy, for me, all of them was done by one person.
Indira Gandhi.
Yeah, and that era, which was the bank nationalization, MRTP Act, and FEMA. And then, of course, these were things which are actively done, and of course, the entire labor laws, which we haven't touched, etc., are the omissions as well, which is big mistake. So the MRTP, that basically there was, you had Bajaj, for instance, going up to the government and saying, please, give me permission to produce more. I have the capacity to do it. I'm producing a good product. There's massive demand for it. But no, you're not given permission to do it. Same thing, right? Yeah. Telephones. There were people who could produce telephones. It's not that only one thing could do it. But then, the government said, no, we have established this thing called ITI, who are the only ones who could produce telecoms, and they will do it as and when they want, and as and when they can build capacity. So a whole bunch of these things, right?
I'm assuming this is also the root cause of mass corruption.
Yeah, obviously. So you wanted one let's say you didn't want to wait for 18 years. What do?
Pay off the bureaucrat.
Pay off the bureaucrat. That's as a consumer. But on the other hand, you want to produce, let's say you're given 100 units as the limit to produce in a month, and you want to produce 150 because there's high demand, you will pay the bureaucrat. So you have money income stream from both sides.
Basically at every level. At every level.
Yeah, it's a perfect rent-seeking economy that you publish, and we're talking about this big industries, right? That's what, as you said, from there were limits on how much you could even buy all other kinds of products as well. So you wanted to buy something good for yourself, you couldn't. There's a limit on it. Right? And this coupled with the import restrictions. That's where the FEMA comes in, Foreign Exchange Management Act, which basically says how much foreign exchange can you get. So even if I had, let's say, back then in 1970s, I had whatever 2 lakhs and I wanted to spend it on something fancy from, let's say, France. I wanted to import a French perfume. I wouldn't get permission from the government. I had the money, but I couldn't convert it to, back then the French franc. So I couldn't buy whatever I wanted. So, all of these things are, complete that command. When you say command and control, this is how invasive the government was, right?
Yeah. How much of this continued through the 80s, or was there slow dismantling that started in the 80s?
80s saw the first acts of dismantling. So again, it was the regime change. And when you had Rajiv Gandhi and I give actually quite a bit of credit to Rajiv Gandhi at that time. But crucially, there was also the Janata Party, which started looking at some of these things. But of course, they were too short-lived and etc. But at least the public discourse was changing. People were fed up now. And again, this goes with even the global narrative. You look at 1978, China is suddenly liberalizing. You've got, by 80s, you've got, 84, 85, you've got Chernobyl, which is happening. The USSR is breaking down. West Germany is, growing at enormous levels. East Germany is not. So there's a lot of stories coming from outside. And we were not, shut off from the world like North Korea is, right? We're still looking at the success stories and the failures. And we're suddenly beginning to relate a lot more with the failures than the success ones. And that's because the way our government is designed and our economy is designed. So I think by 80s, you had a realization. So there was Rajiv Gandhi, and I give, as I said, quite a bit of credit. He wanted to dismantle some of these things. So a bit of the reforms that took place was in the 80s. The initial set of reforms happened in about 84, 85 under Rajiv Gandhi. So a little bit of relaxation of FEMA. So the thing that Rajiv Gandhi did was he didn't do any drastic, I cancel this law kind of thing, but it was more to do, if your limit is 100 now, I'll make it 200. If your limit is, whatever, I'll increase it by a little bit, and so on. So it was a very gradual thing. But, and again, so, all of this, until the 70s, etc., until the beginning of 80s at least, speaking about GDP growth and economic growth, that is where, you had this, it was barely 2 or 3%. Of course, if you don't allow any entrepreneurs to, thrive, and you don't allow people to consume or people to produce, then of course you're not going to have a lot of economic activity, right? So which is why, again, I think most of our readers would have heard of this. This is what was called the Hindu rate of growth, right? That 3% growth. Whatever we tried, we could not just cross that 3% growth, right? And in a lot of years, it was negative. So when the turn of the 80s, GDP growth again fell, and quite a bit, because again, there was the whole bunch of things happening internationally as well. US going through stagflation, whole bunch of things happening which we were affected by, which meant that even India's GDP kind of fell. And that is when, so Rajiv Gandhi said, okay, we should do something about it. So a few of the reforms were done, but unfortunately, the wrong thing that he did was, and I was just discussing this with someone else, I think the direction was right, as in Rajiv Gandhi wanted to do something, and he did a few things, but unfortunately, he also did a few wrong things, and that was massively push government expenditure. So in the 85, 86, he said, the government is going to spend a lot. And they did. They spent a lot. Money that we didn't have. So which is why fiscal deficit went out the roof. Savings were not enough. Investment was, we were borrowing a lot, etc., which led to that, we were importing more than exporting, a whole bunch of things, which led to the 91 crisis.
Right. And also, as far as the when you keep talking about Forex, and for a long time, I never understood why it was important that we had a stockpile of dollars, right? Or pounds or whatever. And then, but if you want to buy something as a government, you're not going to be paying them in rupees, right? This is my understanding of how international currency works, at least at that time. But if you were a country, if you were, like you said, if you want to buy French perfume, right? And if I was sitting in Mumbai, I obviously don't have access to francs. So I have to somehow convert my Indian rupees into French francs. And how do I do that is mostly via the dollar, right? So this is the reason why then, so if the dollars are essentially leaving India and going to France, which was a bad thing. Is that?
Yeah.
At
Yeah,
a very
in a way
basic, at a very basic level, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty much how things worked. As in, in the simplest way to think about this is that Indians as a whole had a lot more demand for foreign products, obviously, which meant that we had to pay via the dollar.
Okay.
Then the rest of the world had for Indian products, so they wouldn't give us dollars. So there was almost, and we were not producing anything that the rest of the world wants. Let's be honest about it.
Right.
So we're not even a resource-rich country like the others.
Yeah. So which meant that essentially dollars it was a one-way flow of dollars, and you can't do that forever, and you eventually run out, which is what happened in the 90s. And some were non-essential, right? So which is what the government put curbs on. So because there was no inflow of dollars and only outflow, they would put restrictions on everything that was an outflow, right? And which you could control. So which is why you couldn't buy anything, you couldn't import anything for yourself as this thing, right? Which is when this entire ridiculous notions of what is an essential item and what is a luxury item came into place. And I find that ridiculous, by the way, because one person's luxury is another person's necessity, and so on and so forth, right?
Of course, yeah.
And I'll get into some of the funny connotations of that as to how it plays out in policy making. Just this, this notion of necessity versus luxury. But anyway, keeping that aside, so what the government decided then is it started classifying all sorts of goods, saying, sorry, do you really need this? No, you don't. You don't need this, you don't need this, because our biggest import was oil. And for oil, you needed dollars. So pretty much what happened was that we started using all of our dollars for oil. I am overly simplifying it. Yeah. But that's essentially what happened. So which is why others couldn't import anything, others couldn't make, do business with the rest of the world, etc.
And then we come to 91, where it all comes crashing down.
Yeah. So this was an unsustainable path. At any point of time, and we tried different things, right? We tried something called import substitution. So essentially we said, okay, if you want a nice fancy pen from outside our country, we'll not import it, but we'll produce it ourselves.
Okay.
So, import substitution. So for everything we tried import substitution, and that again, none of these things that we're saying, I'm as I said, highly simplifying it, right? Macroeconomics is an extremely complex beast. It's the butterfly effect in which happens throughout, right? You do import substitution, then you need someone to produce those things.
Yeah.
So let's take a simple thing of a pen. Now let's say whatever Parker pens are some of the best pens in the world, and people want to buy it. Now you'll say, okay, we won't buy it from outside because you lose forex. And instead we'll produce it within the country. Now who should produce it? Right? So then you say, okay, I'm going to give incentives for people to produce it. So then I make entire set of laws saying, okay, first I direct the banks to say, give special loans at specialized interest rates to those companies which will produce pens. That's priority sector lending. Now, you can't do that if you don't have nationalized banks, because private banks will not listen to you. So, all of these things go in circles, right? And then you create tax policies which creates exemptions for people who will produce these things. Then you will create import slightly. So if, let's say, you will produce most of it on your own, but you need some specialized ink from Germany, just as a random example, okay? So then you'll say, okay, there's no import duties on that. So again, one other distortion. Then you'll say, okay, no taxes for that. Another distortion. Then you'll say, okay, we'll set up a special kind of, both tax regime, labor regime, etc. Entire regulations we'll do separate for you guys. So you create more and more restrictions, right? Exemptions to the rule. Now, what happens when you have exemptions? Everyone wants to be part of that exemption. So then, essentially, I could be, doing nothing, but I will get an exemption, pay off a bribe to one of the bureaucrat again. Get an exemption saying I'm producing pens. All I have to do is produce one pen in the entire year. And then whatever other activity, I'll say it's pen, production of pens. And then I don't pay taxes, whole bunch of things.
The whole cycle.
So that's, pretty much.
All right, so this brings us to the end of the first part of our podcast with Anupam. Next week, we will be discussing what happened post 1991 when we had to mortgage our gold as a country so that we could get some US dollars. And if you like this podcast, don't forget to check out our other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are IVM Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to get in touch on our social media, Joel, your social media is?
I'm Pereira Joel on Twitter and joelpereira.esq on Instagram.
Anupam, your social media?
At Anupam Manur on Twitter.
On both Twitter and Instagram?
I'm not on Instagram.
Okay, only on Twitter. And I'm your okay please on Twitter and Tushar_Abhi on Instagram. We'll see you next time. See you guys. Bye.
Thanks, Abhishek. Thanks, guys.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset and everything sport.
So tune in to the Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.